I'm Chichlowski. I work for Vivid Games as a head of marketing. Vivid Games is one of the biggest Polish mobile game developers and publishers. And the reason why I'm here is I'd like to talk a little bit more about marketing positioning. I'm not sure how many of you are marketers. How many of you people work in marketing? Raise your hands. Okay, a couple of you. Okay. So you're probably going to be familiar with a couple of the concepts I'd like you to present. But before we will start with that, I want to ask you the question, do you know that movie? What's the name of the movie? No, it's called Lone Ranger. So this movie costed $250 million to produce, which is kind of a big budget in Hollywood even. And on the opening weekend, it earned only $30 million. And the problem is basically it was a huge flop. And it is very much related to the market positioning and what is appealing for our audience. And we should as well remember that when doing games. The second one I'm pretty much sure you recognize. So it is the very famous last year big hit, big premiere, which is obviously the new Blade Runner. But the problem with Blade Runner, I'm not sure if you're aware, but it is actually a big flop as well. Which is not that cool because I absolutely love that movie. It is great. But the problem with that movie is that as well it is being addressed for different and very specific niche of people. So it costed as well $200 million. On the opening weekend, they just earned $15 million, which is nothing. So they're basically going to have a big problem. They've already, thousands of people almost lost the job just because of that movie. So all this is very much related to the idea of product positioning. Back in the 70s, very famous marketers, Al Rice and Jack Trout, they come up with an idea of market positioning. And basically they have taken advertisements of Bayer, of Volkswagen at the time, and which were very successful. And they said that the brands that are more successful can communicate in a very specific language, and they are emphasizing the specific features of the product, which are very appealing for their target audience. And before that era, there was a time that was just a stream of communications. It was just communications. All advertisements looked like, here's our product, that's a feature A, feature B, feature C, feature D. And after that, people actually started to take care how they sell it, what they sell it, and how they communicate. To give you a better example of how product positioning works, I'd like to go through a couple of examples. This one is this one I really love, which is a terrible example of product positioning. So who knows what Curse is? Do you know this one? It's a kind of a famous a beer IP in the States, but it's very local. But it's American beer, so it's very popular. So at some point they were like a huge, really big brand, and everybody loved their beer. And they come up with idea of producing a sparkling water. So you can imagine that there was a huge clash in the brand identity and the brand image, because people thought obviously that they're going to produce just beers, right? And they come up with a sparkling water, so no one kind of identified themselves. Their targets didn't identify themselves with this product, so it was a huge flop. Another one is a Heinz. Colorful sub-product, whatever we call it. Basically, Heinz back in the 80s, I think it was 90s, they produced Heinz ketchup, which had different colors. And back when they were testing at a focus group, the idea was great, so everybody loved that. The problem is that back when it hit the mass market and they spent thousands, dollars, millions of dollars on advertisement, it appears that actually for people it's not relevant that much, because actually they just wanted to have a regular ketchup, which is just red. So it is always a matter of how you address your product to a specific target group. Sorry about that. Okay. On the other side, you have a great product positioning. So this is very famous Apple advertisements, Think Different. And they did it, I think, when Jobs came back to Apple in the 90s. And this is as well very famous because it was the first campaign done by TBWA, ad agency, which is very famous just because of working with Apple. And the reason why it is great positioning is because they actually found a niche. And they knew that in a market where computers are just gray and very regular, and there's nothing special about them. You can position the product, and you can find out some special things about that and how you can position that. Volkswagen's Think Small, that's another great campaign. Okay, so when we do and produce games and when we position and think about who we should address, we should always think about genre, age, the region we address, and visual style preferences and setting preferences. The problem is you always have to think about how you're going to mix that together. And some things, they just don't fit very well together. It's like what I said about the Westerns and PvP. Western is a very adult setting, so that doesn't fit very much with PvP, which is a very young type of the game. Okay, so how do you think who's an average gamer? Who would you vote for? A? How many is for A? C? Okay. So it's a funny fact actually, but the average gamer looks like that. I'm not sure if you're aware, but 46% of gamers around the world are females. And well, that's not like a common really knowledge to everyone. and the average gamer is around 35 currently across different platforms. And well, they're just regular guys. Like we perceive usually players are hardcore players, like either younger players or like super nerds, while they're just regular people. Here's a chart from the New Zoo, and they are collected a lot of data regarding the players, so you can see it's actually quite stunning when you think about it that half of the population of gamers are females, and I guess that many of us developers are not perceiving it that way. So I collected actually, I just saw the Toy Twindon. I think he's somewhere there. Yes, hi Toit. So I collected some of the data that's from his workshop, and I give a lot of credits to Toit for that. And he came up with the data of what's the genre and the age of our user base around the world. And as you can see, that there are different regions, and they kind of have a common characteristics. So they gather in the groups like that. And from that point, you can actually see that you have specific geos, which has a tendency to have a specific player base, which has some age and genre. So you can see that obviously the North America, Europe, or Australia, which are much more much more mature markets, are having older players, and they are half male, half female. While the younger and emerging markets like Southeast Asia or LATAM are having a definitely younger user base. And obviously there's Japan, which is something completely different, right? So this one is specifically interesting. There is this gentleman from San Francisco called Nick Yee, and this man has set up a company which is called Quantic Foundry. I highly recommend you to take a look at their work. So what he did, he gathered a survey of, I think, 30,000 people, and he put out a very nice scientific model behind checking the psychology of players and what's their behavior. So he found out that females and males are having different motivation behind playing. So you have males which are being driven mostly by competition. That's why PvP mode is very much male-oriented. So you're not going to see much of there are females obviously playing in PvP, but it is mostly the male thing. On the other hand, females are being very much driven by completion. So that's why the puzzle, the match-3 aspects fits very much this genre and this gender as well. Okay. So I got a couple of other charts that will sometimes concern mobile or sometimes concern gamers in general. So take a note that you will see in a title if it's strictly mobile or if it's gamers in general, because they behave as well differently. Those are, as you can imagine, different types of users, right? So you can see the split between gender on specific genres, right? So obviously, match-free and family games are much more female-oriented, while shooters or sports games are male-oriented. So that's why I said to you before that you can actually put on the chart like a axis, and on the bottom of that, at the top of that, where you have much more male audience, you will have a more PvP experience, while going to the bottom where there are females, you will see much more of a PvE experience. There's different motivation behind it, but it's good for us to understand and what audience actually we're targeting. I put this is a chart I pulled from Flurry. Flurry made this research, I think, 2 years ago, and it is very cool matrix, which I like. So you can see that different age as well has different types of experience they're looking for, right? And also on the left side you have males, but you can see when they're younger, they are they prefer much more the PvE experience. Shooters, basically, that relies much on the competition, while getting older, it is much more about a slower tempo games, so it is being much more about solving different complicated, mechanics in the game. So, for instance, like strategy, but the tempo of those games are much more slower, and they look for something different. On the other hand, the females, when they're younger, they look much more for simulations and puzzle games. When they're getting older, they look more for either slots or like old school type of classic games. So moving a little bit from the gender to to geos, because this is as well the aspect that we should always remember about. You have a list which I pulled off out of different articles of what are the types of games that are being popular in specific regions. And as you can see, there are like I think there are like parts of the world that kind of are similar to each other. They like overlap with each other. So USA and Western Europe is very much similar to each other. Eastern Europe is going to be different, but then you have Asia, which will be much kind of a similar. The MMORPG is very popular, like in China, and Korea will be the same. Japan is very different at the same time, but they have a very long history of gaming. And obviously you have a Middle East, which is a kind of emerging markets, but you have a huge popularity of racing games there and sports games. And Latin America, which is as well kind of an emerging market, but they're in that fact actually they're similar to USA. Okay. So this is again one chart being prepared by Quantic Foundry, and it shows the popularity of a setting, and it is actually something very much different to what you said before about the science fiction. Do you see the second column? So nevertheless, basically, it responds to what I told you at the very beginning of the presentation when we were talking about those movies, right? There is no Western here, as you can see, but I've done a research on my own, so I basically downloaded all the tags from Steam, and I arranged them in an order, so I put them like in groups, and Western, I think, was the second least popular category. And so whenever you think about doing Westerns, just be aware that this is a niche product, and there is only a niche audience that it is appealing to. But obviously the fantasy is the big thing always, so it is very popular. Science fiction is popular, but as well we have to remember that those charts are being prepared on a gamers audience. Those are gamers in general. So if we're talking mobile, we should always remember that our mobile users are less hardcore, let's say. So for them, science fiction will be definitely less interesting than it is for PC users, for instance. And it's still popular. Post-apocalyptic, medieval Europe, you see what's the stuff here. But there are some certain settings which just don't go very much well in gaming, as I said. the Western, which I would recommend to avoid, or at least be really prepared if you go for that. Okay, this is cool. There are obviously, besides genre and settings preferences, there is as well a visual preferences regarding how the protagonist looks or how he behaves. And this is deeply rooted in our history and our culture. So as you can see, there are different types of characters, classic characters for a specific culture. On the USA side, obviously, we have Joel from Last of Us. So middle-aged man who is like really deeply and emotionally involved in his story. He struggles with a lot of choices. On the other hand, like if we would just go across the whole globe, there's Japan, where they have those funny, crazy characters, at least for us. For them, it's very regular stuff. They don't have much of a mature adult protagonists. They're usually children or teenagers with a crazy hairstyle. Obviously, they're manga-style, cartoonish, but as well they have a very simple linear approach regarding the plot. So for Chinese people, they share it in common actually with Japanese. But for Chinese people, if you would create a game that is about choosing a lot of different situations and scenarios, it's no go for them. They just need a very simple linear approach, and the story should be easy as well. It's always about one character who's saving the world without any specific reason to why he should do it. China relies very much on their mythology. So do you know this character? It's a Monkey King, and it's like super popular over there. Whenever you do a game that's going to be oriented on China, I highly recommend just to put that character, because there is a big popularity of those. So they are heavily, and this is coming from their mythology, so they are heavily involved in the mythology, and it is always good choice whenever producing a game for China to look at that mythology and pull up a couple of characters and setting. Eastern Europe is something that is obviously known for us, mostly. We tend to do the very dark, gray, and hard style characters, realistic graphics, but at the same time, those guys aren't good or bad. They're something between. So they're not very clear in terms of their motivations. The funny thing is about Brazil, I had a problem because it was kind of easy for me to talk about different protagonists, because I know a lot of people from those regions, but I didn't know much of the people from Brazil. But I found a friend of mine, and he said that he actually studies sociology as well. So for him, it was a nice topic to talk. And he said that the classical Brazilian protagonist is called malandro, which is kind of a gangster. So Brazil likes the character which always bends the truth when they need to. So they're a bit sketchy. They move, they're not obliging the law that much. They do crimes sometimes when needed, but they're generally good. They're type of Casanova guys. So given all those facts regarding the geos, the genre of the game, the setting of the game, and what's the audience, I tried to pull out and proposed a couple of specific types of the game that will be appealing for a specific audience and geographics. And this is what I came with. And I think, obviously, this is not like super strict. I think there's just a couple of proposals, what could be appealing for those groups, and I don't think it should be treated as a golden rule, but it gives you an idea how the map looks like. So when we do a game for a Western world and for males, whenever we go younger, we should always realize that those guys would like to have a PvP in a game. As well, we need to realize as well that, especially in a mobile world, when doing a game for younger audience, these are not our players that much. The players are over 30 actually. But when we go up, we obviously tend to slow down the tempo of the game, and it's going to be much more PvE oriented. there's going to be much more of the sports games and strategies, etc. On the Far East, besides Japan, but on the Far East, on the eastern side of the world, as you can see, there are no many of the players which are over 40 or around 40. It's just because, as I showed you on the previous screens, previous slides, they're basically emerging markets. So for them, for China, for Korea, there's gaming is a new stuff, and they don't have much of a mature gamers. But the biggest distinguished, anyway, on this chart, as you can see, is between males and females. So whenever we do a game, if you think about the game that's going to involve both of those characteristics, we should always remember that it is important to be in a specific setting and to avoid specific clashes, like as I told before, the Western and the PvP, right? Generally, as we said before, the girls will look always for the story-driven stuff and for brain challenge. So this is something that we should remember. Okay. And lastly, a couple of sources which I took all this data from, and given the chance as well, I'd like to thank Toit very much for helping me with this presentation as well. And here's his contact, so I highly recommend you contact him because he's a really good free-to-play specialist. Okay.
That was a good promotion, an example of a good promotion. Thank you very much, Jan.